So, were you successful? Here's my solution. We should add an input field. So I'll add a horizontal line again just to have some separation. And then my input field. The label, of course, is optional. I want the user to enter a username, so let's add an input which receives this class, which is form control. If we save this and have a look at our application, this is how it looks like. Now, if you don't want to have it sit directly on the edges, you can of course add some Bootstrap styling to this. So maybe a container with a row inside of it, and then the call XS12 class. So feel free to wrap your content in there. It's not required for the solution of this, of course. So with that, we got our input field here with the username. Now let's bind this username to a property of our TypeScript file. So here I will add a new property to my app component, and I will name this property username. This will be a string, and I will set it to an empty string initially, like this. Now we learned that we can use two-way binding to bind to this. So on my input here, I'll add two-way binding by adding squared brackets and then parentheses. This is this two-way binding syntax, and then ngModel. Now with that added, I can bind to my username like this. Now important, for ngModel to work, you need to make sure that in your app module you have forms module added to the imports, because the ngModel directive technically is part of the forms module provided by Angular. So make sure that you have this. You should have it there by default when using a CLI project. And then with that, we should update the username on every keystroke. Now to be able to see that, I'll add a paragraph below the input, and here I want to output username. Now with that being output here, we can save this. ngserved should be running, of course. And we should see that if I enter supermax here, we see it below the input. So the first two tasks here are solved. Now let's add the button. So we'll add a button below the paragraph where I will say reset user. And this button will first of all receive some Bootstrap classes, button primary, to make it look nice. But more importantly, we should disable it if the username is empty. Now how can we do that? We have learned that we can bind to the disabled property. Now, even though we used that a couple of times, that's of course not the only property you can bind to, but it's the one we will need here. Now, disabled. We could set disabled to some property which is true or false, or we directly set it to true or false. But as I explained, between the quotation marks, you simply have an expression which resolves to a true or false. Now, since we want to disable this, if the username is empty, we could simply check that between the quotation marks here. So we could say disable this if username, this property, is equal to an empty string. So two single quotation marks inside here. With this expression, this will return true if username is empty. Therefore, then this button will be disabled. Otherwise, it will be false and the button will be enabled. Let's see if this works as expected. After saving this, the button is indeed disabled at the beginning because username clearly is an empty string. But as soon as I type anything in here, you see it gets enabled. So this is how we can use property binding again with any expression which returns us the value the property we're binding to expects. So in the case of disabled, true or false. Now with that we get this solved too. Now we should also add a click listener to this button so that we can reset the username once we do click the button. So event binding with normal parentheses. Let's bind to click for this. And here we could call onReset, a method where we then set the username equal to an empty string. But since this is all we're going to do, I can also just say username equals empty string. And now don't mistake this for the syntax we used here on the disabled property. There we have 3 equal signs to check something. Here we have 1 equal sign to assign a value. With this in place, we should now be able to go back to the application, enter supermax here, and if I click reset user, it's empty and the button is disabled again because we reset the username string. And that is our assignment on data binding solved. I hope you enjoyed it.